Yep. All right. Good evening to those of you who are joining us live stream. Last week, we did not have a live stream as we had the team from Michigan in, and we had a bilingual service, worship service, had testimonies. Now we're going to continue in our transformation and discipleship study, and we have talked about principles that are important that we need to recognize and apply to our lives. We have spent quite a bit of time talking about those, and as I remind you, I've been using a combination of two books. This one here, which says Transformational Discipleship, which was by Barry Sneed and Roy Edgman. We're almost finished with it. We're going to be looking at the flexibility principle, which is pretty much wrapping up. And then the other book that is Transformational Discipleship has to do with how people really grow. And this one was by Eric Geiger, Michael Kelly, and Philip Nation. So there are things as we look at these lenses that we go through. And so again, just to kind of quickly remind us, we've looked at the fellowship principle, which talks about you have to have that relationship with Christ. The relationship principle, which that is that relationship. The fellowship is that you follow Jesus. The empowerment is God has made us to be able to have the power because of the Spirit. And then as we talk about the lifestyle, and this is where we run into a lot of problems, and I just broke my book, but that's okay. Books, they don't make them like they used to. They just fall apart. I've got quite a few of them that are in that state. But, as you look at that lifestyle, I mean, this is another one of those areas where we really started walking into having problems because people don't make living for Jesus a lifestyle. They kind of want to do it a periodic thing throughout the week, but it's not something they're going to do every day. And then Scripture talks about the fact that we need to do that. And then, of course, we talked about the accountability principle, which is the other thing that people don't like. Accountability, some people, is a bad thing. But any of us who have ever had jobs where we have multiple responsibilities and everything else, we like accountability. We like to be able to say, okay, here's what's important. This is what we need to do. And, we have people who are helping us make sure that we're staying on task. Otherwise, we're all over the place. So accountability, but we also have that responsibility of being accountable to one another. And again, as we talked about that Sunday, as we were finishing up chapter 5, as we talked about that submission, and even as we talk about submission in the context of relationships, with submission comes accountability. We're making sure. So like we've already talked about, some who are coming back to the church, they're all excited, but we need to make sure that we're walking alongside them to help them, but also to provide accountability. And so God talks about accountability all the time, and ultimately we all give an account to God for how we live our lives according to His Word. So those are the things that we looked at. So when we walk into the flexibility principle, and in this book, we're talking about the lenses that we walked in. And as we talked about those, we had the gospel lens where we had to say, okay, here's what we need to be aware of as far as, how does the gospel fit into this? And of course, the gospel is not something we just talk about here at church and then it's not done anywhere else. We actually have the gospel is involved in everything that we do because it is that. So it is about the truth. And so when we look at that truth, the truth is the gospel. The truth also helps us with our identity, and the truth also helps us with disciplines, which is what we're finishing up. We're doing with that. And then as we finish this section, we move to this other lens, which we will talk about next week. We'll start on posture, which we will talk about how do we look at our weaknesses and realize our weaknesses? how we learn how we're interdependent upon each other, and then how we need to have an outward look. And then we finish it up looking at leaders. But you notice the leaders ends up being last. It doesn't do you any good to find leaders if you don't know what you're looking for. And leaders need to be picked and validated based upon truth and how they fit in, the posture of where they fit into the things of the church and transformation discipleship. So those are the things that we're going to be looking at. But like I said tonight we're going to look at the flexibility principle. The flexibility principle is this: diverse people need flexible and adaptive ways to experience spiritual transformation. I'll read that again. Diverse people need flexible and adaptable ways to experience spiritual transformation. So now, based upon that, as I've read, what is your understanding as you just listen to that statement? What would you come to?
Not everybody grows the same or in the same way.
Okay, not everybody grows the same way or at the same rate. Okay, what else? There's different ways. So there's different ways. Some people. This is one of those things when I teach. A lot of times when I used to do a lot of the conferences and I used to teaching. When you're looking at who's sitting in front of you, this way we're doing right now is probably the worst way to teach. So I'm just telling you up front, it's the worst way. The reason why is because I'm doing all the talking, and even though I ask questions and I do get some interaction back, basically I'm doing all the talking. It's hard for the interaction. That's the other reason why those of you who are listening live stream, that we keep encouraging you to be here, is because you can't interact live stream. Oh yeah, you can write a comment, but you're not here to sense what is going on in the room. And part of that is because that's not how God designed it. God designed the body to come together and to be together. And as we are together, we learn these different things. So when we teach, there's some that are artistic. So we were talking about the young man who came down with First Spanish and how he does so much with the music. And we also look at our own, Isaac that, does all the things with music. They're artistic. And so they use that type of thing. They learn more in that way. But then we have some people who are analytical thinkers. So they're looking at things, they're tabulating facts, they're pulling all this stuff, they're analytical thinkers. And then you have some people, that they're natural thinkers. They learn more with, let me go outside, let me look at nature, and let me handle, those kind of things. And there's more than that. There's like about 8 different ways that people learn. And you have to find out which one is their main one, so that when you're teaching, you're utilizing those things to be able to make sure they're connecting to learning. And then again, going back into the learning part of it, when someone learns something, that means they have not only received the truth that you're trying to teach, they have been reminded about what you've already talked about. They've learned to put it together, have that understanding, but they still have to wrestle with, do I believe this to be true? And if so, then how do I apply it to my life? And then when they come to that point and they say however long that takes, so again, it goes back to learning at different rates and different ways, however long that takes. Once they get it, then they're able to respond to what God is having them to do. And learning has taken place. And when learning takes place, the natural thing for them to automatically want to do is share it with somebody else. That's how God designed us. There's no getting around it. People keep trying to mess that thing up and keep trying to come up with other things. But that's how God designed us to learn. That's how God teaches us. Here's what you need to know. This is what I've already told you. Now, this is how you put it together. Now, do you believe what I'm saying? And we have to decide, yes, God, I believe what you're saying. And when we say yes, then God says, this is how you're going to respond, that you believe that, because now your learning is taking place. You will respond in obedience, and then this is what's happening. Then you're going to turn right around. You're going to do the second part of the Great Commission, is that you're going to share it with somebody else who needs to know that too. That is transformational discipleship in its simplicity. That's how it works. We make it complicated because what do we rely on? What are the things that we rely on to make sure that things, our own thoughts? So we rely on our own wisdom of how we think things ought to be. What else? Well, we need to rely on God a lot, but that doesn't mean that everybody does. What do they rely on a lot of times? Do what? The way they were raised, so how they were raised, that experience that they have, so experience becomes part of it. What else? Well, yeah, we are by nature selfish, and so therefore that makes that really hard. But the other thing that we do is when we're looking at these things and how we try to put that is a lot of churches rely on, oh, what program? Oh, the church down the street is using this program, and look at the results they're getting, so we need to use that program too. The problem is, it may work for them because that's what God had them do, and it reaches the people who they're reaching. But that program may not work here because we have a different dynamic going on, and something else would be better. And that's why we have to discern what is that. And of course, now we're living in a time where even all the curriculum is getting written, and a lot of it is very, very scattered, shallow, and so it causes a lot of problems. And so that's why we had to look to some other things because it was not accomplishing what we needed to accomplish. So again, this is one of those things where we talk about flexibility. But when we're applying flexibility to the church, again, the word flex ability. When I use that word, how do you see that word? How do you define that word? Adaptable. Elastic, yeah. I mean, so that means adaptable. You can, yeah, being able to stretch. Pat?
I see it as the ability to change my way of thinking about something that might work better in another way.
Okay, very good. That's pretty close to almost the definition they have here in the book. Did you read the book? Actually, they say flexibility means capable of change, and again, using the adaptable to adapt to new, different circumstances to adjust. Flexibility. Now, when we think about the church, do we always think about the church being flexible?
No, not usually.
No. Most churches are how do they see themselves? Same old way. Okay, what else? Okay, sometimes that's what's happened. It was put together by a previous generation, and so those things which made sense to that generation, now we're dealing with 3 generations later, and that really doesn't communicate to this generation. So yeah, there's a disconnect. And are we having that problem in church today? Yeah, because our younger people are having a hard time relating. And of course, what they say is that the church didn't do its job and it failed. And to some degree, they are correct. What they're not correct about is if they are believers in Jesus Christ and they're part of this body, they have a responsibility to help bring about the flexibility or adapt to the change that needs to be done. Actually, if churches are paying attention to what God is leading them to do, churches are constantly making adjustments. It's interesting because Sunday, as we have our fellowship breakfast, which we haven't had one in 2 years, over 2 years. So we're having one because the pandemic, for the most part, is done. We still have everything running around, but now everybody's learned how to deal with it like they probably could have done at the beginning, but that's another thing for me to talk about some other time. But we're going to have that. But during that time, between that and the service, we will have teachers meetings. So those of us that are teaching, we're going to sit around, and what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about, are there changes that we need to make to adapt where we're at? And in children's ministry, you're constantly having to do that because how you have classes set up has to do with when kids were born. And the smaller the church, the more noticeable it is when you have gaps. So if you go 5 years and there's not any babies being born, what's going to happen? You're going to close the nursery because you're going to be ready to have the nursery if somebody walks in with a baby, with a toddler. But for the most part, by the time they hit 5, you already know they're heading to school. There isn't going to be a preschool unless somebody else has kids that are going to be that. So there's going to be that flexibility. How do we change that? You know, and so those are things the church has to look at. Are we making those adjustments? One of the adjustments I've had to make, because the school made that adjustment, I don't necessarily still agree with that adjustment, is that they classify youth from 6th grade up. And I'm saying a 6th grader is still trying to figure out what's going on and really to stick them in. I mean, it's bad enough when they're 7th graders. But now we're putting the 6th graders in there. And so that changes the dynamics because they're just now really starting to become abstract thinkers. So again, this is, understanding who you're teaching. Emotionally, they're not mature at all. They're all over the place. And so there's still that need. I need to be like a kid, so I still need to have all these little activities and I need to play and I got to do all this other stuff. But yet now they're supposed to be teenagers. And of course, now we're looking at teenagers, and most of our teenagers, the problem that we're having with them is that when you sit around and try to do the method we're doing right now, you're boring them to tears because they're used to.
They're too old to be kids and too young to be teenagers.
Yep. And so you see, these are things that we have to start looking at and say, how do we work this? God always knows how to do that, because when we talk about various approaches, just thinking about it, when we look at Jesus, what were some of the ways that Jesus used to teach? Parables.
He also used history of the Bible.
He used history of the Bible. What else did he use? Sometimes he used compassion to be able to deal with a situation. So see, it wasn't always. So what we're seeing is that when we look at how Jesus did, just to run down, because I have a nice little list right here that goes. I'm not expecting you to remember that, but I'm just giving you an example of this is how Jesus did. We already talked about he used parables to get down to everybody's level. So when he taught parables, he was teaching parables with something that everybody pretty much understood in that time period. Now, what's the problem with parables today? When we use parables from the Bible today, what do we have to compensate for?
Their time period, they lived different back then.
Okay, the time period they lived different back then. So we have to do more explaining what was taking place culturally, why Jesus used this to teach them, because this is what they did. But unfortunately, I mean, in Jesus' day, most of what Jesus was dealing with was an agricultural society. Are we an agricultural society? So many people have a problem understanding agricultural things. That's one of the reasons why when I began to really enjoy teaching Psalm 23, the reason why I have to break it down is because when David was making the statement, "The Lord is my shepherd," he could have stopped right there, put a period, and boom, and it would have been the shortest psalm in the Bible. Because to David, by making that statement, "The Lord is my shepherd," period, he already said everything he needed to do. But why? Why to him that was clear?
He was a shepherd.
Because he had been a shepherd. He understood what it meant to be a shepherd. And so what he was doing was he was making this analogy that I know that God is my shepherd, which means the shepherd is the one who took care of everything that had to do with the flock. He led the flock, he protected the flock, he provided for the flock. There was a relationship. The shepherd knew his sheep. The sheep knew his voice. Jesus uses that analogy of being a shepherd, the good shepherd, the great shepherd, all those things, because he still built on those, again, because the people in his time period were understanding that. But today, we don't have a whole lot of people that are shepherds.
Are you one?
To some degree, yes.
What I say?
To some degree, I am, because I do with livestock. I don't have the sheep, but I do have the goats. And so therefore, and then at the same time, as a pastor, because that's why we call them pastors, is because, again, what does the church refer to as?
Flock.
A flock. And like even when you get into Peter, when Peter starts talking about the fact that as a pastor, he needs to remember that he is part of the flock, but he has been given that responsibility to also care for the flock. So actually, when you look at a flock, are you going to have animals who are going to step up and be lead animals? And the rest of the animals all follow them? Yeah. I mean, you're going to have it, whether it's sheep, goats, cattle, horses, whatever it is, there is going to always be that one that they're going to look to, and that's the one that's going to lead. They're going to step up into that role. Now, does that mean that it always is going to be a good? No. And a lot of it depends. I mean, if you have, like, if you've ever, Philip Keller, who writes a lot of books about shepherding and about lessons he learned from a sheepdog, and, he writes a lot of those kind of things. I mean, he actually has written the thing about the shepherd's view of Psalm 23, which I've read multiple times. And so a lot of things that I share actually were things that I think he's in New Zealand as he takes care of sheep. Those are the things that he took care of and he did. So he learned those lessons. And he said, this is what God was showing me. So God actually had him write that book to help those of us in this time period to kind of understand, oh, that's what that's meaning. That's what it's doing. And it changes the way that we look at our relationship with God. So yeah, and going back to what Sharon's doing, like in my way, yes, I'm a pastor, and so therefore I care for the church. But God has also helped me in a physical standpoint to understand all that, because I do have livestock. So see, like when you get to 2 Timothy chapter 2, when he gets there, which will be in a couple of weeks probably, on Sunday mornings, when Pastor Nathan gets there, you see, I understand 2 Timothy chapter 2. I understand what it means to give things to men who are apt to teach and to move that way. I understand what it means to be a soldier. I understand what it means to be a farmer, and I understand what it means to be an athlete. And those are three analogies that Paul uses as he's talking to Timothy, helping him understand how he needed to be faithful in doing what he needed to do and sharing the gospel and helping people grow, and what he needed to help convey to them. So this is what I'm saying. Jesus used parables, but we also know that there was times like in John chapter 13 when he washes the feet and he's talking to them. There was times when he had to be very in your face, because Peter wasn't going to have him wash anything, because he didn't feel like he was, he was going to actually have him wash all of him, and he said, "No, all I need is to wash your feet, because you're already clean." And again, Peter wanted to have an argument, and Jesus basically said, "No, you need to stop this." So Jesus at times had to be in your face. And there's a lot of people who don't like people when they get in their face, but sometimes that needs to be done. There also was when you look at the woman who was brought before Jesus by the ones that said they caught her in adultery, and they basically have they dragged her out, basically caught in the act. The interesting thing is they didn't bring the man, but they brought the woman. They were trying to trap Jesus, but yet you see that Jesus is very, going back to what Bonnie said, he was very compassionate. He was very loving. He was kind, and he helped her walk through this. And again, basically diffused the whole thing by, okay, you who has sinned throw the first stone. Who's going to do it? And then as he's writing in the sand, we don't know what he's writing in the sand, but it's obvious he's writing something, because all the accusers leave and the only person who's standing is the woman. And then he says, "Go and sin no more." Yeah. Right. Right. And again, we're dealing with technology, and technology has really causes a lot of problems. It can be used as a tool to be able to teach, but at the same time, it can be misused. And in this case, a lot of times it is misused and leads people to wrong conclusions and, doing. Yeah, yeah. And that's one of the things as we deal with the other generation, the new generation, the current teenagers, is because technology drives everything. You take all their technology away from them, and they would go crazy because they have no concept of what to do with their time. Which is sad, because it also impacts how they build relationships. And again, so they'll, these are some of those things. So Jesus, did that. He always took time to have conversations with his disciples. He was comfortable with small groups, but yet at the same time he could teach the big crowds. So as we look at those different things, Jesus learned how to do different things to make sure that people were learning to bring about change. And sometimes they didn't want to hear what he had to say, because you remember in John 6 where they really were just coming in and they were challenging him, and he basically said, "The only reason why you're hanging around with me is because you're looking for food. And to be my disciples, this is what it requires." And the Bible says that many of them departed and followed him no more. So again, we learn that this flexibility. So when we apply it to the church, and we apply it to our church, we have to look at where are we at. We can't get locked in. This is the way we've always done it. Because that will never work. Because whether we like it or not, even though we may do something similar, do we do the exact same thing every day? No. Because if you did, you would do it all in the same order. You would do it, I'm oversimplifying this, but let's just face it. You would squeeze your paste on your toothbrush exactly the same way. You would stick it in your mouth and you would brush it the exact same way that you did the day before that, the day before that, and you would do it at the exact same time, and then you would rinse the same. That's just how it would be. But do we do that? The answer is no. We do what we got to do, and when we do it, sometimes we get in there and we have enough time to get ready to brush our teeth, and other times, oh man, it's really getting late. I got to get moving, and we run in there and we do one of them quick scrubs. And the thing is that we need to understand that as God is talking to us, God is a God who knows exactly how to talk to us at that point. And again, this is another one of those things that the Hebrew writer was writing, where he talked about how the God spoke to us in various ways. And he named some of those ways. Well, see, a lot of people were getting locked in. That's the only way God can talk to us. And God can talk to us however God needs to talk to us. The key is, are we flexible? Are we listening so that we can make that change that he is giving to us to make? Because every day God is going to ask us to change. Every day God is going to ask us to change. And so, when you start looking at the Gospels, they keep showing you this flexibility over and over again with Jesus, and how he spent time. And then there was other things that just how he dealt with things, and he didn't do everything the same way. 2 times his disciples were caught in storms on the Sea of Galilee. One time, Jesus was in the boat. What was he doing? Sleeping. And what was the reaction of the disciples? Yeah, they're basically waking him up and said, "Don't you care that we're going to die?" I could just, I always like to drive. We're going to die. That's where they're at. And Jesus does what? He gets up and does what?
Calms the storm.
He calms the storm. But the other time they're caught in a storm on the Sea of Galilee, Jesus is not with them. But how does he get to them? He walks on the water. And when they see him walking on the water, what do they think?
The ghost.
It's a ghost. And Jesus has to say, "Don't be afraid, it's me." I love that story because Peter, of course, a lot of us can identify with Peter because Peter's just going like, "Lord, if it's really you, bid me to come." And what does Jesus do? Come on. And Peter literally gets out of a boat in a storm and walks toward Jesus, and he is walking on water toward Jesus until he makes a change he shouldn't have made, which is he shifts his eyes from Jesus and he puts it where?
No way.
On the storm. And then immediately he begins to sink. And then he's paralyzed. He's a fisherman, but all of a sudden now he's paralyzed. He doesn't know what to do, and he screams out, "Lord, save me." And of course, what does Jesus do? He reaches down, and what a lot of people fail to realize, how does Jesus get him back into the boat? he pulls him up out of the angry waves and they walk back into the boat. And then the rest of the disciples all realize, wow. And they're amazed and they worship because they believe, Jesus is Son of God. But even with all that's going on, this is all happening before Jesus goes to the cross. And Jesus even tells them, I'm going to the cross. Jesus even tells them the sign of Jonah, which is what? What's the sign of Jonah? Right? Jonah gets swallowed by the great fish. And what happens? How long does he stay in the fish?
3 days.
And what happens after 3 days? The great fish spews him out onto dry land. And this is a picture of what is going to take place when Jesus goes to the cross and he dies and he's in the grave. And then the grave is can't hold him. And he's going to rise again. Jesus has already told them these things. But this is why we have to be flexible. Did they get it? So they didn't get it, and Jesus goes to the cross, and they're seeing Jesus die on there, and they're seeing him being buried. Did they get it then? And when the women go to take care of his body, but they don't find him there, and they find the stone rolled away, and they find the angels, and the angels tells them to go and tell the disciples he is risen and he's not here. And they go do that. What was the reaction of the disciples?
You're nuts.
Yeah. I mean, they're sitting there going like, are you sure, ladies? I mean, are you sure? I mean, two of them go and check it out, Peter and John. But basically what it is that here's this learning curve, this flexibility. They still haven't got it. They haven't made the change that even though Jesus has said, I'm going to the cross, I'm going to die, and I'm going to rise 3 days later. Meet me in Galilee. And they're hiding. Let's just even go. So then he's on the road with the two disciples to Emmaus. They're having this question. They don't even recognize him. And he begins to start expounding from the Old Testament, how the Old Testament prophesied and pointed to Jesus being the Messiah. And the whole time they're on this walk, the whole time that he's telling them this, even they say, when he is speaking, our hearts burn, we are excited, but they still didn't know it was Jesus. They didn't know it was Jesus till they get to the house and Jesus reclines, and then all of a sudden, boom, it hits them. It's Jesus, and then he's gone. And then they get so excited, they go all the way back to Jerusalem to tell the disciples, we've actually seen Jesus. As you sit back and you look, again, the flexibility principle is, look how patient Jesus was, and look how many times he told them, and they still didn't get it. And even when he presents himself in the room, they're still wrestling with it. Thomas, of course, is not there. And so when they tell Thomas is sitting there, well, I'll believe it when I can, actually touch the wounds. And so the next time that Jesus appears, guess what? Thomas. What I'm trying to get across is when we talk about the flexibility principle, is every one of us need to realize that every day God is going to do something to change us to be more like his Son, Jesus Christ. I can't tell you what that is because for each one of us it's going to be different. But I can tell you every day Jesus is going to speak with you and you are going to be challenged to change. And as you change, it should in turn help others to change. And as a church, we need to continue to look at what God is doing and realize, okay, here's the adjustment that we need to make so that we're continuing to make the changes God needs us to make to be on mission to do what He's given us to do. But the problem is that most people are not flexible. We're used to how we want life to be, and let's keep it that way, and let's not mess it up because I know this. Don't change a whole bunch of stuff on me because I know this. I'm good with this. I can handle this. And that's exactly what God is saying. I don't want you to think you could handle it. I want you to trust me, and I will help you handle it. It's what we need to be looking at. So he does a lot of that as he does that. So when we look at structure, like for instance, part of what we did, and we have studied that, had to do with covenants. We had to study about covenants. And the reason why we had to study about covenants is because most people, when they look at covenants, they think it's a contract. And it's not a contract. Because a contract is, I'm going to do this, you're going to do that. And as long as both of us do it, then it's about a contract. The minute you don't do what you're supposed to be doing, now I'm not obligated to have to do what I'm supposed to do, and we're out of the contract. Whereas a covenant is I'm covenanting together to do that, and you see that when God covenants with us, God is always faithful to carry out His, but God always makes allowances and ways that we can come back to Him because He already knows we're not going to carry out our end. Because we look at the Abraham covenant. Did Abraham walk through the slain animals that he had set up to prepare for that covenant that he made with God? Did he walk through that? No. What did God do? Brother Isaiah said, what did He do? God made Abraham do what? He put him to sleep. Because God was being merciful and saying, I'm not having you walk through this because you're not going to be able to keep your end of the covenant. But I'm going to go through and I'm going to make this covenant with you, and I will keep my part. And it's the same thing when we look at Jesus. Jesus came, Jesus went to the cross, Jesus died because He fulfilled the law and He was sinless. And He met the requirements, and He became the last sacrifice that was needed. And His blood is what makes us righteous. Not us, His blood. But as we walk through this life, what God is going to do is He's going to continue to put things in our lives that's going to bring us to make a change so that we continue to move to becoming like Christ. That's how God designed it. And He designed it not for us to walk by ourselves, but to walk with each other. And that's why we have all the one another's. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges that all of us have, is making sure that we're doing all the one another's. Because the one another's are not always easy. But that's what He wants us to do. That is, again, how we learn. And so when we even look at even more of that, when you look at Romans, I think it's Romans 14. When we look at Romans 14, this is the other thing as we talk about the flexibility principle, is how we interact with one another in regards to what we fall in. In Romans chapter 14, verse 1, it says, "Accept anyone who is weak in faith, but don't argue about doubtful issues." Oh, wow. That's verse 1. And so basically what it's saying is that we need to realize that we're going to come into contact with people whose faith is not going to be as strong as ours, and we don't need to sit around and argue with them about things that are not really important to argue about. And unfortunately, I see this happening all the time. I've seen it before I went to Bible college. I definitely saw it when I was in Bible college. I used to see guys who would get down to where they were so mad at each other because one believed this and the other one believed that. And they were both trying to convince each other that they needed to change the way they saw things, and neither one of them was going to budge an inch. And they just constantly sit down there going. And the thing is that both of them could have been right. Because there are some things, especially when we talk about Revelation, we talk about the last days, there's some things that you can have. There are multiple interpretations. There are some that are more acceptable than others, but all of them have validity to some degree. The thing is that what we're dealing with is we have a God who can accomplish whatever he wants to accomplish, however he wants to do it, and he can do it in a way that none of us came up with. Because remember how God said in Genesis 3, when God said in Genesis 3 that he was going to send one to deliver, what was the description of how he was going to deliver? That he was going to come and he was going to do what? He was going to
Serpent's head.
the head of the serpent's head, but the serpent would bruise his heel. Now, that doesn't really give you a whole lot into the plan of what God is going to do, right? But as we sit there and we walk through the Old Testament, God gives us more and more glimpses of what the Messiah is going to look like, to the point that he actually has Isaiah write what he writes about the prophecies concerning the Messiah. And we have quite a bit of those prophecies in the book of Isaiah. And yet, even with that, with the scholars that were there in Jesus' day, looking at all that, they still didn't see it. Part of it is because they wanted to see it how they wanted to see it. This fits into my format. Because when they talked about the virgin birth, how many of them actually believed that it was going to be the Holy Spirit that would bring about the conception? That probably didn't enter into any of their minds. Because when Isaiah talked about a virgin birth, they were thinking the way they thought, which is, well, she's a young woman and she's never known a man. But she will know a man, and then she will be pregnant. But when God says that virgins will bring forth a child, God was actually saying a virgin will bring forth a child. They didn't get that. He didn't plan for him to be a king because he was their king. And Samuel had all kinds of things about that. And God had to tell Samuel, you need to make this adjustment. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. We need to sit down, and as we look at this, we see how God continues to do what God does. And so he even gives them, Isaiah 53. They definitely didn't know what to do with that one, because that one's describing the suffering servant. And they didn't want to have it. How can you be a conquering king if you're a suffering servant? You see, they didn't get that. Because, they were not putting themselves in a position where they were allowing God to speak to them. Now, does that mean that none of them got it? No, I believe that there was Old Testament saints that got it because they put their faith in God and they continued to believe God was going to do what he's going to do. But for the most, they didn't. But then, even to the point where he starts saying, this is where he's going to be born, this is what tribe he's going to be born of, this is whose house he's going to be born of. I mean, God just narrowed it right on down. So how do you miss it that when there is this miraculous birth that has taken place, angels announce it, shepherds come in and say, this is what's taking place, and, within a short period of time, we all forgot that. Exactly. You don't know what you're talking about. You really, they actually would believe that they all hallucinated at the same time. Just like when Christ was rose from the dead, and he was seen by um, about 500 people. They all hallucinated as they saw Jesus. It's easier for them to believe that they all hallucinated than believe that God actually raised him from the dead. But you see, these are the things, people, when we talk about being flexible. We also have to look at it as it goes on in this. It says, accept anyone who is weak in the faith, but don't argue about doubtful issues. One person believes he may eat anything, but one who is weak eats only vegetables. One who eats must not look down on the one who does not eat, and the one who does not eat must not criticize the one who does, because God has accepted him. Who are you to criticize another's household slave before his own Lord? He stands or falls, and stand he will, for the Lord is able to make him stand. And he walks through this. Chapter 14 has to do with the relationship of those who are spiritually strong in their faith to those who are spiritually weak. And there's even a relationship in there, and that is part of this flexibility principle, is that those of us who are spiritually strong need to be able to take those who are weak and find those ways that we can help them become stronger. And the ones who are weak need to realize that God is going to place people who are more mature to help them be able to grow, and they're willing to accept that instruction. And so, as I've used that example before, in many circles, I can step in, and if I'm dealing with mostly people who are not in ministry, then I would be classified as that which would be the spiritually more mature, because I'm supposed to be a pastor and I got a degree, from a Bible college and all that blah, 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 that stuff. So that's how people would see it. And you can, but I'll be quite honest with you. I've been in churches where I've run into some dear saints that never went to Bible college, but they knew their Bible better than I know my Bible. And it was always a fun to talk with them because they were a wealth of knowledge. And did I learn things from them? And the answer was yes. Even though I was in the past in a position of a pastor, because God put them in my life to teach me things. But I also know that there's been times where I'll go and I'll get in a group, and I'll be in a group, and I may end up. There's been times when I've been in a group where there was Claude King and Henry Blackaby and Avery Willis. I've met some of these guys who've written a lot of stuff. Avery Willis, for those of you who don't know, he's the one who wrote Master Life. When I'm standing in front of those guys, believe me, I am not the spiritually mature. I am definitely teach me. Because these guys probably forgot more than what I've even read. So you have to be ready to know where you fit in. And that's part of that flexibility. God gives you that discernment. So see, we've talked about some that we're running into that God is bringing them back into the church. And so some of us are going to need to walk alongside them. We're going to need to be the ones who are there to help kind of prop them up as they're learning. And we need to be praying that they will have that flexible attitude that they're willing to learn. But then we also need to understand that as they grow, there's always that possibility they may surpass us. But you see, God is the one who dictates all that. And so understanding what God is doing. So this is one of the reasons why it's important that we understand God's word. Because, Romans 14 talks a lot about that. That relationship, how we work with each other and how we take care of each other. So the flexibility principle is a very key principle in the church. And unfortunately, like I said, many churches have lost this flexibility because they're so stuck in, this is the way we do it. We need this program, we need that program. And they're not looking at how God is equipping and what God is doing in their midst. So again, part of that has to do with the experiencing God is how's God working? What is God doing? Because God is not going to give a church something or equip the church with something that he doesn't plan on using it. Like for instance, in our association, we have one church that has a free medical center. I mean, it is a free medical center. It runs just about everything. They have doctors, nurses, dentists, optometrists, I think just about everything you can think of that believe that God has given them the ability to be able to serve. And so there's times when they have this clinic open, they open it up to the public, allow people to come in, no charge, and help these people by helping them with their health. But the reason why they did that is because God kept equipping that church with all these medical people. And so what are we going to do? If God's equipping us with all these medical people, what are we going to do? And so there's a lot of things that we need to look at. What is God equipping us with and how is he equipping us? So that's going to help us understand what we need to do and how we need to do it. Last week was a very good week because it allowed us once again to come in contact with how do we receive people coming and serving us. For some, that was kind of different because we're always used to doing it ourselves. And then there was also that blend. Like in the kitchen, there was a blend. They took care of some, but there were still some things that our people took care of. And, and so there was, it did. As a result, everybody benefited from having a good fellowship meal. I don't think there was one meal that whole week last week that was a flop. Every one of them was good. And we all got kind of used to that. That gave you a taste of what it was kind of like in Acts 2, where they broke bread together, where they had that fellowship. So many of you were able to experience that. They were able to experience that because for them, many of them, that was their first mission trip. First time they've ever come in to do something like that. They had no clue what they were getting into. They didn't know what they were going to experience, but now they do. And now they take that excitement, they take it back up to First Spanish. And of course, we have what we have here, where we can talk about here's what needs to happen. This is what we need to do. And how can we prepare even better? Because see, one of the other things is that as a pastor, when I went up to talk to them in March, I talked to a mission leadership team. Of that leadership team, only 2 of them made it to Ohio. Okay? There's other things that came up, health issues, different things that came up, and so that's why they didn't. He actually was hoping to have a bigger team. That didn't happen. Things happened, it just didn't happen. And so when I sit down and say, here's what we know that we're going to do. Backyard Bible Club, fellowship meals, and light construction. What did we accomplish last week? Backyard Bible Club, light construction, fellowship meals. And the interesting thing is that I wasn't planning all those things. I had my part of what we did here on the receiving end, but the planning was done by them. And I just rolled with it. It's the first time I've ever had a mission team that came rolling down in waves. Most of the time when a mission team comes, we all come together and we invade. This one was kind of like, we'll send 6 the first time. It kind of trickled in. I'm going like, okay, that's different. That's different. Which led me to have to look at Tuesday because I'm going like, we're doing backyard Bible clubs. I said, Carlos, how we doing this? Because I already knew we were going to have kids. And so we had to talk about what that was going to look like. Well, God had all that because I had backyard Bible clubs being in the backyard. Backyard Bible clubs makes sense. Aren't you glad that we didn't do that? Because it was hot as all get out. But see, he had all the technology that what they were doing and doing, so they needed the technology to be in here. And it actually worked out better because it was cooler because it was hot. Yep, we had 8 kids. And moms were coming and bringing them. And so there was talking. There was a whole lot of stuff was going. But that Tuesday, we had to supplement because they only brought down 6, and 2 of them were kids. And I'm going like, okay. So we made the adjustment. We were flexible. Yep, exactly. That's what it was.
At the Bible club,
Yeah. Yeah, it just kept going and see again,
we had 20, that came, didn't we?
yeah, we had 20 that came. But see, even with that, some of them still had to work, so I had to make
Yeah.
arrangements for that. It was just wild. I'll tell you right now, it was a completely different mission trip experience than I've ever had. But it was okay. It was one of those things that we had to learn just to roll with it.
You know, they came and some of them didn't come till almost the last day, only stayed one night maybe.
Yeah,
You know, they were coming the first 3 days.
yep. And so there was things that came up. So again, flexibility. And that's one of those things that all of us have to learn. Because it's not just for mission things, it's what we do here as a church. So we need to say, okay, what do we need to do? How do we need to do that? What are those adjustments that we need to bring about the change that we see God saying needs to be done?
You know what I like about it? I was watching it online, and I like about when he was having a sermon here, and he wanted everybody to hold hands. He wanted everybody to get out and join hands. And that would remind me of back in the times when we used to have that meet and greet
Yep.
during our service.
Before COVID came.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that was just something special.
Yeah. But see, again,
Get closer to each other.
yes. And for this group, it would probably go. But for the group as a whole, it wouldn't fly because many of them are still,
Rightly so.
and rightly so.
COVID's still
Yeah.
pretty.
I mean, it is one of those things. I mean, it's just like I know that you wore a mask sometimes.
I wore a mask because I didn't have any teeth.
But, you know, the thing is that, you know, again, it's the flexibility. You know, it is what it is, and we just need to roll with that. So again, that's what I'm saying. That's a principle that's there that I see most churches are missing. We need to make sure that we have that principle operating.
I hope we have a good turnout for breakfast.
I do too, but if we don't, we'll roll with it. I do too. So with that being said, because I'm going to wrap this up, is those of you that are watching, we are having fellowship breakfast Sunday morning, 9:30. So bring something to share. We would love to have you here. And then we're going to have the 11 o'clock service. And then we have 2 o'clock, we're doing visitation. So that's what Sunday is going to look like. So we encourage you to be involved. And again, that may require you to make some changes. Be flexible. Let's go, Lord, in prayer. Our dear Heavenly Father, again, we just thank you because you are the God who helps direct change. And so, Lord, we just pray that we'll be mindful of what you're doing, that we'll have a desire not only to study your word, obey it, share it with others, but as we do that, that we are allowing you to work at conforming us to the image of your Son, Jesus. Be with us now as we go tonight, as we continue the rest of this week. Be with those prayer requests that we've already lifted up to you. Just prepare us for Sunday. We do pray that we will have a good turnout for the fellowship breakfast. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. You are dismissed.
Bonnie, count,